And Ann's father passed away this summer. He was 86 years old, I believe, and he was a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge. And he would tell us how he spent one night under a bridge. I think it was 20 below zero, and it was snow probably up to his neck, and Germans were coming over that bridge all night long. And that's the kind of hardship that these kind of guys that preserved our freedom went through. And I really appreciate what each and every one of you have done out there. I'm going to talk to you about the Constitution tonight. We like to complain about government, Mark. Reminds me of a story of a young man who wanted to join the monastery. So he went to see the old Monsignor at the monastery, and they talked and discussed things for a while and decided that he was going to join under this condition. He could only say 2 words every 20 years. So with that understanding, he joined the monastery, and the young monk began to study and pray and read the scriptures, think about higher things. At the end of 20 years, the Monsignor said, "Son, what is it that you have to say to us?" And he said, "Bed hard." Well, he studied, prayed, looked at the scriptures, thought about higher things. 20 more years went by. The Monsignor, getting older man, called him in and said, "What is it, young man, that you have to say to us?" And he said, "Food bad." Well, he studied and prayed and went on with it. Another 20 years went by, and the old Monsignor now called the young monk, who was now the old monk, in, and he said, "What is it that you have to say to us?" And he said this, "I quit." The Monsignor said, "I'm not surprised. You ain't done anything but complain since you've been here." So that's kind of what we do when we look at government. I want to talk to you about the Constitution today, and I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as I can, but some interesting things to think about. I'm going to ask you a question here, and just think, nobody has to answer, but go back 100 years to 1912. How would you know that you had a federal government in Corinth, Mississippi, other than a post office and the money in your pocket that said United States of America? How would you know that you had a federal government? Think about that for a second. Now fast forward 100 years to 2012, how would you know that you had a federal government today? Would you know that you had one? Most people shake their head and say, "Yeah, we definitely know we have a federal government." What is the difference in 100 years' time? The Constitution hasn't changed, but we have a whole lot more government. And some things the government does is good. They take care of veterans like they should. They're obligated to do that. But we've got a whole lot more government than we did 100 years ago. The Constitution hasn't changed. How can that be? Go back and look from 1912 and move up to 1952, for example. How many people in Alcorn County starved to death in this county in 1952? How many? Probably none. How many people were homeless in Alcorn County in 1952? Living under a bridge or out in the woods somewhere? Probably none. I want you to think about that. We'll come back to that a little later. Now I'm going to go all the way back to 1776 and think about the founders who signed the Declaration of Independence. When they signed that document, they said that this young nation was free, and we were no longer under the bonds of Great Britain. Great Britain was the superpower of the day. They had the greatest army and navy in the world. And when they signed that declaration, 59 men, they knew that the chances of defeating them in a war was not good at all unless the Lord had intervened, but they did it anyway. They signed that document. And if we had lost, every one of those 59 men would have been hanged by the British as traitors. They would have died for doing what they did. But they did it anyway because they had a burning desire to be free. They wanted to be free people. They won that war. The Lord did intervene, and we won the Revolutionary War with soldiers, well, equipped with nothing almost. Didn't even have shoes. Marched through the snow and left bloodstains barefoot. But we won that war, and the men who signed that document and who led the country went on to render a second-rate service to the country. They wrote the U.S. Constitution. I've got a pocket copy of it right here. The main objective, these men who thought and done this and risked everything, their main objective was to make sure that this country remained free. So they wrote that document with that in mind, and the way they wanted to preserve freedom was to limit government. So they wrote a constitution that limited the new government's powers. The main way that they did that was to limit the powers of the new lawmaking body, the U.S. Congress. So in Article 1, Section 8, they told the new Congress exactly what they could do. And it's a very limited list of things they actually can do. You might remember that from school. If you don't remember, go back and look it up on the internet or whatever and read it. Very limited powers the Congress had. Over the economic affairs of life in the new country, they only gave them one power, and that was to regulate commerce among or between the several states. Before the Constitution was ratified, we had the Articles of Confederation, and states imposed tariffs on each other. So goods moving from North Carolina to Virginia might have had a tariff. They thought that would impede prosperity, and they didn't want that. So they federalized that, but that's the only power they gave Congress over the economic affairs of this country. Congress remained limited for decade after decade after decade. We went through the war between the states. We went through Reconstruction. That ended, and everything stayed the same until the 1920s. Now, before the 1920s, there was an amendment to the Constitution that added the federal income tax in 1916, or 1913, the 16th Amendment. Other than that amendment, the Constitution is pretty much the same as it was. There's some procedural changes, but it's pretty much the same thing. After they did that, we went through World War I, taxes went up. World War I ended, Calvin Coolidge was president, and he lowered the federal income tax rates. He's the first president that did that along with the Congress. We went through a period of economic prosperity in the roaring 20s. And when that happened, we went through an economic bubble. I'm kind of giving you all a history lesson here, but this leads up to the points about the Constitution. Just like the bubble we just went through, real estate, where people speculated and borrowed money to buy real estate thinking it would go up, they'd sell it and pay off their loan. They did that in the 20s with stock. And they believed stock would go up. They borrowed money and made the values go up. And when the stock market crashed in 1929, the federal government began to take some steps that led and made the Great Depression what it was. And I'm going to go over that for a minute because it ties all in. Herbert Hoover and the Republicans did some things that made the Depression what it was. They raised the federal income tax rate. It went from 24 to 63%. Now, in Alcorn County, before those days, you wouldn't have known anybody that paid income taxes because the threshold was so high. So that was kind of an unknown thing, but they raised the federal income tax rate. Number two, they passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, and they said, we're going to keep jobs in America, so we're going to put tariffs on everything coming in the country. We're going to keep these jobs here. Well, the rest of the world retaliated, and they did the same thing. They put tariffs on everything coming out of America into those countries. And world trade is what it was at that time, shut down. So they raised taxes, they stopped world trade in its tracks, and also the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and the New York Fed dominated that, and they restricted the money supply that was out there. If you remember your father or your grandfather talking about the Depression, they said if you had $1, you could buy about anything. I see some heads shaking. Well, the reason was there was no money in circulation. They cut the money supply off. There just wasn't any money. So those three things that happened when Herbert Hoover and the Republicans were in office made the Depression what it was. Now, Roosevelt and the New Deal Democrats were elected to Congress to change all that, but they didn't. They left all that in place, and they did some things that made the Depression worse. They started enacting all these laws to regulate the commerce that goes on in the country, tell people what they can buy and sell things for, what commodities would cost, working conditions, wages, all kinds of things that have never been done before. They also raised the federal income tax rates again, and it went up to 90% for a top rate. Those five things, through Hoover, through Roosevelt, made the Depression what it was. Now, you remember a minute ago we said that Congress didn't have the power to do anything but regulate commerce among or between the states. So when they began to do all this stuff to regulate the economy, a lot of people were unhappy about that, saying Congress didn't have the power to do that. There's no power for them to do that in the Constitution. Now, the 10th Amendment leaves the power of everyday economic life to the states, to the state of Mississippi. That's why they can regulate what we do out there, taxes, that kind of thing. The states were left to do that. The federal government didn't have that power. But Congress started doing it. People were unhappy. They went to the Supreme Court, and a lot of these New Deal acts were declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Franklin Roosevelt was unhappy with that. So he said, I'm going to pack the court. I'm going to take it from 9 to 15 members. When he did that, the Supreme Court got intimidated, and they started backing off of these things. And by 1942, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called Wickard versus Filburn, that's going to come up this coming year in the Obamacare case. They relied on that recently. In Wickard versus Filburn, a farmer in Ohio was told by the federal government how much wheat he could raise on his farm. And he said, I'm an American, you can't tell me how much wheat to raise on my farm. I can do whatever I want to. Well, the federal government disagreed, and they fined him $117 for raising too much wheat on his farm. He went to the federal courts. He went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court of the United States said that Farmer Filburn's consumption of wheat, the fact that he raised it, he didn't go out and buy it in the marketplace, but he raised it, and what he did is feed himself, feed his animals. He sold a little bit in town, didn't cross any state lines. They said that his consumption of wheat in the aggregate across the country may have a substantial effect on interstate commerce. May have, just may. So therefore, Congress could regulate it. They basically said they could regulate individual economic activity. Well, when they said that, the U.S. Supreme Court in 1942 rewrote the Constitution. The founders wanted to limit government and limit what Congress could do, and the Supreme Court said, no, we don't care what the thing says, what the Constitution says, we're going to say they can do it. And when they did that, that opened the floodgates for Congress to come in and do everything you can imagine. Well, what has been the upshot of that in 70 years? No major law that Congress has passed has been declared unconstitutional because they didn't have the authority to do it. What has come from that? Well, today, you and I are less free than our great-grandparents were. When they were coming up, when they were our age or older, they didn't have a government telling them what to do all the time and regulating everything they did. If you're in business, you know about that, or health care, or you're a teacher, or education. The federal government tells us all kinds of things to do. Back then, they didn't know that. That would be unthinkable. That's one of the things that's happened because they don't follow the Constitution. But the second great problem is with it, because they've done all these things they didn't have authority to do, we are $15 trillion in debt today. And that's just the beginning. The Government Accounting Service recently said we're more like $30 trillion in debt because some things aren't on the books that they count. We are in danger of losing our country because of this debt and this overreach by the federal government. Now, everybody in here was in the military or a spouse of somebody in the military or a relative. Everybody in here fought or was prepared to fight to preserve the Constitution. When you took your oath, you said that you would protect and defend the Constitution. Isn't that what you said? That was the oath that we all took. But we were ready to fight to preserve it. We had politicians in Washington who've actually ignored it and done whatever they wanted to do, and they put the country in jeopardy. No outside force has been able to come in and take our country, but the inside forces of politics have just about done what no enemy of the country could do. We are less free because of it. And one more thing I want to say about Congress while I'm up here. They changed the welfare laws in the 1960s. Before that, Congress didn't get involved with that kind of thing at all. But in the 1960s, they changed the welfare laws in the country. And they said, for example, that a young lady who got into trouble, who needed some help, well, they'd give her a whole host of benefits. Medical care, housing, money, all those things, under this condition, that she did not have a wage-earning male in the home. That is, there couldn't be a husband and father in the home for her to get the benefits.